Dear friends and colleagues, nice to meet you again. I'd like to host you in my YouTube channel. Please push the button subscribe, share this video, comment it please, and ask your questions. Don't hesitate it, please. I ask you this because of my channel is a channel of useful information for correct decision. So let's start. Dear friends, I'd like to focus today on such issue, food safety. The topic of our today's conversation is Putin's quiet weapon in the global food market. Let's turn our eyes to the visit of the Treasury Secretary of the USA, Janet Yellen, to Warsaw in May. In the Polish capital, she visited the Ukrainian refugees and made many interesting statements. Among them, she thanked the Poland for its contribution in the resolution of concerns around the global insecurity. And also she appreciated and highly assessed the Polish efforts to assist in getting the Ukrainian wheat and other food supplies to the global food market. At the same time, the leading international financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, etc., EBRD, pledged to spend billions of dollars to resolve this issue, to deal with the problem of food insecurity. So, according to the described facts, we can conclude that this problem is global, it's very urgent, and it's to tackle it we need some innovative solutions, decisions, etc., and toolkit for sure. Let's me to introduce my vision of this problem. Because of war in Ukraine, the world food market is cut off from this food supplies of wheat, barley, sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine. This can be explained by the supply chain disruption, for example, and the situation is exacerbated by the previous pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, yes, and the hungry world, which is mostly concentrated in the global south, faced a very dangerous situation when on the other hand is the supply chain disruption, and on the other hand is the further rise of food prices. Okay, the scale of this problem is also enormous. According to the Economist assessment, nowadays the number of people who can't be sure that they will get enough food tomorrow has risen from approximately 400 million to more than 1 billion persons. It's the same time it is to 1 billion and 1.6 billion persons. It's skyrocketing numbers, skyrocketing trend, and nearly 250 million of them are on the brink of famine. So the numbers are very awful. At the same time, we should stress that Ukraine export food goods to food calories to approximately 400 million people. And the core cynical point in such situation is that in Ukrainian ports, due to blockade of these ports and logistics units and logistics hubs, etc., approximately 25 million tons of corn, wheat, and other food supplies are trapped in Ukraine. It can't be delivered. It can't be delivered to the global food market. At the same time, this volume of food supplies is approximately equal to the annual consumption of the world's least developing economies. This volume is, I repeat, please, this volume is currently trapped in Ukraine ports due to the blockade. And at the same time, we can observe the skyrocketing prices on the food in the global market. Okay, the situation is strange, but it can be explained from the different perspective. There are global food market bottlenecks, and Ukraine and Russia exploited these bottlenecks, and they hold the part of the global food market. And some countries, especially in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, are considerably dependent from the imports of food supplies from these Eastern European countries, which currently are involved in war conflict. And that's why we need to assess the total amount, the concrete figures of such bottlenecks. Okay, so according to I will use the assessment of the experts of The Economist and the Bruegel, well-known Brussels-based think tank. Russia and Ukraine together supply approximately 28% of globally traded wheat, 29% of barley, and 15% of maize, and 75% of sunflower oil. So as for sunflower oil, the Bruegel experts operate with different figure. It less than 60%, approximately 57%. But the most interesting situation that the most interesting fact that between 35% and 40% of the European Union's sunflower oil import comes from Ukraine, which is currently trapped in the blockade. Okay. And at the same time, Russia and Belarus is the first and the sixth biggest global exporters of fertilizers, and they represented a total of 20% of global supply of fertilizers. So we can assess the size of such bottlenecks. Ukraine and Russia, as an exporting countries, for sure have considerable leverage. They have pricing power, and Ukraine doesn't want to begin these commodities wars. At the same time, from the Russian perspective, in their opinion, in Russia's elite opinion, it is possible to start a quiet war with the global food market, and this damage will be focused and will concentrated on the hungriest world. The Quiet War is a term coined by Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, in the social media, when he promised that the Russian food export will be directed only to friendly countries, and at the same time unfriendly to Russia countries will not get enough food supplies to meet their needs. At the same time, we shouldn't forget to stress that that some countries in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa fully dependent from import from Russia and Ukraine. For example, the Lebanon and Yemen imported approximately half of their cereals from Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, these figures for Egypt and Libya is this figure for Libya and Egypt is approximately 2/3. So when the supply chains is disrupted, these countries face with real problems. The vulnerabilities become obvious, and they need fresh, innovative decisions and toolkit to deal with it. And at the same time, we may turn to the next point of our analysis. It's the deglobalization in food trade and so-called defragmentation, the process opposite to globalization, and the Economist brightly described this process. First of all, we may conclude that the globalization has its own advantages to overcome these threats. For example, the suppliers may be replaced. At the same time, the wheat stocks in North America, in North Africa represent about a half of last year's import. Yes, it's clear that existing free trade environment proposes some options to deal with this issue. But many people use protectionism to achieve their goals, to guarantee their economic sovereignty, maybe. And for example, since the war in Ukraine started, 23 countries from Kazakhstan to Kuwait have declared severe restrictions on food export. And these restrictions cover approximately 10% of globally traded calories. To compare, Ukraine and Russia has 6% of total globally trade export of calories. So their total share is approximately 12%, excuse me, Russia and Ukraine. To compare with export restrictions equal to approximately 10%. So at the same time, also 1/5 of all fertilizer export is also restricted. It may be defined as measures used by Russia and Belarus, for sure, if we compare the figures. Okay, and for example, for sure, we may conclude that these problems and resulted in rising prices, in further rise prices. The upward trend of food prices was obvious before the war struck. It's maybe explained by pandemic COVID-19, by supply chain disruptions, by energy commodities rise, prices rise, inflation. Okay, but the war in Ukraine exacerbated this process, And so at this moment we turn to the crucial point of our presentation, of our today's meeting, and I will explain you how the Russia weaponized the wheat. Okay, according to the experts of World Food Market, there is no scarcity of physical foods. It's all not about deficit. It's all about prices. Against such background of rising prices, the rise of food value is also the worst possible self-fulfilled prophecy. And this prophecy has potentially has serious political implications. I will explain it. Okay. First of all, I should stress that households of developing economies spend the highest share of their total income on food in comparison with high-income economies. For example, some countries in the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa spend approximately half of their income on food. At the same time, this percent for developed countries is between 7 and 10%. Okay. And at the same time, these regions is specific hydrocarbonate diet too. It's also important factor to be mentioned. The rise of prices resulted in the situation when, against the background of energy crisis, the coffers of the public budgets, the public finance are not featured by excellent financial position to subside the price of food at the same time. And the problem isn't the absence of food. It's the inability of people in low and middle income, some middle income countries to pay this new price for this food. Well, this is the main issue. And to demonstrate it, I found the article published in the well-known newspaper, American newspaper, Washington Post. It revealed, presented for their readers such statistics. In 2021, Russia and Ukraine crops made up approximately 28% of world's exported wheat. At the same time, the export market covered only 1/3 of global wheat production. So, respectively, from this perspective, Russia and Ukraine together make up about 13% of the world's wheat crop produced. And Ukrainian wheat alone is only 3.7%. So this 3.7% is trapped in Ukrainian ports, and it can't trigger famine across the globe, for sure. But at the same time, the danger is that the Russia began to exploit this bottleneck and pick up the winners and losers for whom will be exported its wheat. Yes, Mr. Putin, President Putin, is experienced and seasoned manipulator, and he knows that the perception carefully managed can become reality. It's very cynical game, but Russian top officials prefer to boost food prices, and to explore the options of triggering political instability in the Sub-Saharan Africa and in the global south. The rationale is sound enough. The analogical food prices rise was observed before the Arab Spring in 2010. And this factor is of uncontrolled uncontrolled food inflation is the breaking of informal consensus existing between the political elites of the global south and their citizens. When the first living needs are met through the subsidies, through the guaranteeing the low prices, etc. And in such situation of using quiet weapon, the wheat of a quiet weapon, the pillars of political stability in the global south are under threat. And Russian Federation play very risky games for both parties, but it preferred to push this button and start this global geopolitical or geoeconomic wars, in my opinion. But at the same time, I should stress that there are no sound economic rationale for people starving in the global south, for famine in these countries. It's all about price inflation expectations, price rising expectations, and speculative part is also financial speculations have also contributed significantly in this awful situation. For example, in Chicago Stock Exchange, the trades on food commodity futures were stopped for a period of approximately 5 days with the outbreak of this war, because traders went beyond their limits, their prices on food futures skyrocketed. So the stock exchange management was forced to pull the plug and stop the market calamity at the same time. So this fact of financial speculations and is also obvious, and it also exacerbated these problems at the same time. So I describe you the fundamentals of such quiet war, of such food commodities war, and what key findings and what key conclusions I may present to you. For example, first of all, Russia maximally effectively exploits its bargaining power via supply chain bottlenecks. It uses the supply chain bottlenecks not only fossil fuels market, but food market is also the object of its geoeconomic war with the West. Let's tell you. To illustrate this fact, during the session of the United Nations General Assembly, more than 140 countries voted for a declaration condemning Russia's invasion in Ukraine. This group of the most developed countries accounts for approximately 61% of world merchandise trade and 70% of the world's combined trade, capital, information, and people flows. Look, imagine these figures, more than half. At the same time, I operate with the link from Harvard Business Review article. Okay, The trade between Russia and these voters for United Nations declarations comprised for approximately 2% of global trade totally. Additional information: the other trade bloc between China, India, Russia, and the other countries who don't vote for this declaration comprised for approximately just 5% of world trade between these countries, but mention the figure 2%. The total trade turnover of Russia with the club of the well-developed and richest countries with free market ideology and market economy. Okay, and at the same time, Russia effectively uses its leverage and exploits the supply chain bottlenecks in the fossil fuels and food market. It's an awful situation, but Russia elites are cynical and skilled enough to understand they have edge over the civilized world. The second item of my conclusion, of my findings, is that nowadays the monetary regime of inflation targeting demonstrates its ineffectiveness in the modern reality. The commodity price rising increase is a litmus test to demonstrate that to regulate price stability and to safeguard price stability only within a limited monetary toolkit is impossible. I have mentioned earlier that President Putin factually boosts inflation via fossil fuels and food commodities price rise. So previously, before this crisis, before even COVID-19 pandemic, the crucial task of the leading central bankers was to increase inflation expectations in the developed world, and they almost all failed to meet this need from the monetary perspective. And it's maybe a little bit ironically and cynical conclusion, but Russian President Putin managed to do the central banker's work. He succeeded in managing inflation expectations, but this process is nowadays uncontrolled, and this process have potentially disastrous political implications across the globe. Mention this, please. When the supply chains bottlenecks resulted in such situation of is such awful situation. It transformed into the specific tasks, geoeconomics, geopolitical tasks. Okay, and the third item of my findings or key conclusions is that nowadays we observe tug of war between the West and Russia. The West sanctioned Russia due to its war invasion in Ukraine, and at the same time, Russia use fossil fuels and food commodity price increase in the similar way. All these processes is suggested to have the same functioning mechanism. I'll explain it. So, first of all, economic pain triggered by sanctions or price in commodities. At the same time, the material losses of the richest tycoons and cronies and billionaires and fall in living standards of the ordinary people, population impoverishment, etc. This resulted in social unrest, and it may result in elites coup. So the regime, political regime, is overthrown, is expected to be overthrown, and we have the obvious political gains. This transformation mechanism of economic pain to political gains. And the logic of West sanctions, as well as Mr. Putin's geo-economic war, is the same. And in the nearest time, we will be able to compare the effectiveness of such toolkit and make our conclusions. Who will succeed in these risky games and disastrous for ordinary people across the globe? So, dear friends and colleagues, thank you for your attention. Please push the button subscribe, share this video, because my YouTube channel is the channel of useful information for correct decisions. See you again. Bye-bye.